welcome back to Level Up Test Prep. This is going to be the shorter speed run version of the prior video. Evaluate the extent to which the Black Civil Rights Movement was successful between 1945 to 1974. Just a quick recap. So this is going to be the end of World War II to the end of Nixon's presidency. There's two ways to argue this because it wants you to evaluate the extent, meaning you could either argue that there was some success, a moderate amount of success, a lot of success, or a complete success, 0 being no success or a complete failure. As I said in the other videos, whenever you're posed the question, evaluate the extent to, it wants you to show how much progress or gains were made in a certain time period. The answer is never 0, but it's also never 100. The answer is usually somewhere in between. So you can argue that it was a success, and we're going to call this the success optimism bias, or it was a failure, and that is going to be the pessimism bias. The argument is going to be rooted on these two grounds. The civil rights movement was successful in gaining political and legal rights. The failure was that it was sometimes thwarted by opposing groups. They could never fully get social acceptance, and they never caught up economically with their white counterparts. So, what could you argue in writing such an essay? I already have the answers typed up, and we're going to go over them one by one. It's important to note here, it wants you to evaluate the extent, so you can argue that Truman's desegregation order was a step in the right direction, but an executive order isn't that powerful. It doesn't accomplish the same as sweeping legislation or major landmark court decisions, so this isn't going to be saying too much here. Next stop would be Eisenhower's executive order. So I'm showing that they can be successful either in Democratic or Republican administrations. But here you're just seeing executive force. You don't really see the major sweeping legislation until 1960s, which means it stalled in the first half. So 1945 to really like 1964, all you saw were mild gains, but it spiked in between like 1964 to 1968. Third primary source you could cite is the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report from 1968. There was a solid increase in black voter turnout. Example is from the report, 19.3 to 51.6 in Alabama. Next stop. You could argue the political and legal grounds, but you could also look at the assignment more holistically and look at the social and economic gains. So there was a census report issued in 1978, which stated in 1940 Black Americans only made up 6% of white-collar jobs, but by 1970 they made up 24%. This shows, again, an optimism. Things are getting better for the Black community in the aforementioned time period. Now you could say it's not 50 or 60%, but this ties back to your thesis that you could show evidence of gains or massive gains, mild gains, or there could be some shortcomings or stall outs. So source 5, these are all primary source documents. LBJ signed the Great Society programs, which he explicitly stated were to close the gaps between black and white. So now you're seeing both the political and legal gains, and now you're beginning to also see economic and social gains made. Source 6, Nixon hired a Philadelphia union because of their compliance with the affirmative action law. So now you're seeing both Democrats and Republicans supporting the civil rights movement through labor, social welfare programs, economic gains, voter turnout, and desegregation. That is how I would argue the success bias. Now, if I wanted to argue that it was a failure, I'm looking at lack of social acceptance, economic mobility problems still posed a major issue, and many thwarted the legal gains made. Let's check it out. And again, I already wrote the answers here. This is a great primary source, Patrick Moynihan report issued by it was a study done by the federal government, where he said racism is a virus in the American bloodstream and that black people are going to expect another generation of discrimination. So this ties back to the social acceptance argument, saying civil rights movement couldn't fully integrate them on the social equal playing field, even though they made gains in other areas. As it relates to school integration, Governor Maddox of Georgia in 1969. So this is over 15 years later, after Brown v. Board that people are still opposing the school integration efforts. So Governor Maddox of Georgia in 1969 opposing school integration on the grounds of freedom of choice, saying parents should have the right to choose. Okay, now we cited LBJ on the positive front, but we'll see how he helped harm the black community in some aspects. So LBJ signed the ominous Crime Control and Safe Streets Act. It increased policing in black neighborhoods and increased police brutality and general harassment. Next up, Nixon, the same man who helped facilitate affirmative action compliance and broadcasted this and publicized it, was also the same man who created the DEA, which led to a war on drugs, which largely had a greater impact on black Americans and other groups and led to mass incarceration. So this is one of the ways they stop kind of that social mobility and the progress. Number 5, the Southern Manifesto of 1956. So just 2 years after the Brown v. Board education, many Southern states united against integration efforts. So the civil rights movement had a big battle in front of them, because even though they had one president to back them up, and some integrations followed after, and they had the Supreme Court on their side, many Southern states would not implement or follow through with these directions. So in this case, they're really failing in the kind of first half of the time period mentioned here, so 1945 to 1956. So a very slow start, you could say. Next stop. And integration didn't really take off until Nixon, actually. Number 6. The same census report that I cited here stated, however, in 1978, the 25.4 million blacks in this country remained far behind whites in almost every social and economic area. So, there you have it. Evaluate the extent to which the black civil rights movement was successful between 1945 to 1974. They had some small gains here through the executive. There was the Brown v. Board education, which really helped back them up in the equality movement. However, major opposition from states, even in the North, by the way, to block school integration and forced busing. However, there was definitely gains made in voter turnout, white-collar jobs, anti-poverty measures, and kind of a general consensus that discrimination was wrong and that presidents were taking the lead by working with groups that would comply with affirmative action laws. Again, the failures, the pessimism bias, the shortcomings, unfortunately, according to Patrick Moynihan, who was a liberal man, said that there would be another generation of discrimination. You had major governors opposing school integration even well over after a decade into Brown v. Board, increased police presence, a war on drugs that really disrupted the black community and had very harsh punishments for drugs, possession and selling and manufacturing. The Southern Manifesto in 1956 showing that they would not integrate the schools, and black Americans still lagged behind white Americans in social and economic areas. All right, and that is the speed run of the earlier video. Thanks for leveling up with me. See you in the next one. Peace.